So I've always wanted to attempt to make my own duffel bag, and a few months ago I did that. In today's video, I'm going to take you through the steps of what worked for me and even ways that you could evolve it and customize it to details that you might like. So if you want to make your own duffel bag, this is what you'll need. You'll need some outer material as well as some inner lining material. I opted for a thick toweling material on the outside. I just thought aesthetically that would look nice, and also because it is quite sturdy, it will handle the elements of being thrown around while I travel. You could use something like a denim, a canvas, a thicker linen. You could use a cotton toweling like me, whatever else your heart desires. It's nice and thick and sturdy and will survive. I'd probably avoid using anything with stretch in the material. Then for the lining, I just used a simple lightweight cotton. Not only is that accessible and affordable, it just does the job for the inside. You could play around with a cute pattern to go on the inside or a simple block color. That is the beauty of DIY. You can make it however you wish. For the amount of material, I would recommend getting about 1.5 meters of each. So 1.5 meters of your external material and 1.5 meters of your lining material. Obviously just convert that to inches, yards, feet, whatever you guys use. Then once you've got your materials, we'll just then need the final accessory details. You'll need 2 clasp hooks, 2 D rings. I personally found it was easiest just to go into store and kind of play around with what colors and sizes and details that I preferred. My D hook ended up being a metal material, and then my clasp hook ended up being plastic. That was purely based on the fact that when I was there, that's what was available and I liked the most in the black. You could play around with silver or gold finishings or even whites and other fun colors to complement your style. Then we'll need the material for the straps. Because I went kind of like a stony beige finish of the external material, I thought I could play around with the straps being a little bit of a contrast compared to that. For the main handles that actually attach onto the bag, I went for quite a thick strap material, as I know that that would be nice and sturdy. I think it ended up being about like 5 centimeters, or what's that, like almost 2 inches wide. Going around again and going into store and feeling the thickness of it, I felt like that was going to be practical for a bag. And then for the strap, that's going to be the overhang detachable one. I could have used the same strap material, but I opted for, I guess, like tan colored thinner style as well. Keep in mind this one will be going through the clasp hooks, so again, when I was in store, I was able to check that the strap that I was going for was going to fit in the clasp hook. If I went for a thicker strap, I'd obviously just have to go for a wider clasp area for that strap to be able to wrap around. If you're doing separate types of straps, the overhanging detachable one, I would recommend getting about 1.5 meters. And then for the one that is going to be attached onto the bag as the main handles, you'll need 3 meters. Then we'll need the zipper to go across the main section of the bag. I ended up getting a 56 centimeter or a 22 inch zip, and I went for a jacket style. You'll see in the step that I attach it, I think it being able to come fully undone allows it to be a bit easier of joining it all together. As well, the jacket style zippers just had a nice thicker aesthetic to it, which I preferred. Otherwise, a regular zipper is totally fine if you prefer it to be a bit more subtler and simple. I ended up actually getting a second zipper as well, as you'll see in one of my inner pockets. I thought it might be handy so I could put more valuables or things that I don't want to get lost in my big bag. This is totally optional. You don't have to have a zipper or even an inner pocket. I think mine was probably just 6 inches, which is like 15 centimeters. And again, I think I opted for that thicker zip style. And last, we would just need the thread. Ideally grab a variety that matches your outer material as well as all your straps, as we'll be sewing directly on these areas. Ideally, I opted for something that blended in because that's the style I wanted. Of course, you can always go for a contrasting thread if that is your preferred look. Before we jump into sewing, I just wanted to quickly introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, which is Cricut. As an avid DIYer, you've probably seen many of my projects utilizing their machines to customize the finer details. I love that throughout the recent festive season, I was really able to take the personalization of gifting to the next level with my Cricut Maker 3. From creating custom cards, leveling up basic wrapping items like ribbons, zhuzhing up table settings, and even adding that final touch to the DIY gifts. The variety of what Cricut machines can do, from precision cutting, engraving, and even drawing, will forever blow me away. It really gets my mind racing with ideas, as every blank canvas from fabric to paper cards, thrifted homewares, and so much more can be personalized no matter what the occasion is. Christmas was the perfect taste tester, and I can't wait to spend the year ahead getting creative with bespoke details when gifting with Cricut. For example, I was able to add a custom design to this simple ribbon by utilizing the Smart Iron-On heat transfer vinyl. After weeding out the design, it was then time to heat up the Cricut Easy Press and iron this vinyl in place onto the ribbon. After letting it cool for a short moment, I could then reveal the final look. It's a fun way to play around with customizing the actual gift itself, as well as the opportunity to make the experience of unwrapping super personalized with little keepsake elements. Or if you're like me and you're wanting to make this year the year of hosting, this is our moment to level up table display elements. The previous ribbon idea could be reimagined for a name tag on a glass so people can remember which one is theirs, or even creating custom vinyl stickers to attach directly to plates or glassware with names and fun taglines. In particular this season, I really enjoyed making the most of the pen drawing feature and giving the menus or name cards that handwritten personalized feeling without having to sit there and bulk write it all out. Here, let me show you how. After searching menu options within the Cricut design space, I found an option that suited the vibe of the occasion. I input the menu details and then set up the Cricut with the chosen pen tone and let it do its magic while I got back to preparing the space. So handy. Layering the table with these extra details just really helps add that touch of character for a memorable event. Maybe I could even take inspiration from the earlier iron-on details and incorporate it into my DIY duffel bag and customize the straps. Honestly, there's always something to ponder with the endless project ideas when it comes to Cricut. Speaking of the duffel bag, let's get back to making it, along with a massive thank you to Cricut for sponsoring this video. If this piqued your curiosity, you can check out their range along with an array of DIY ideas through the link in my bio. Now it's time to start determining our measurements so that we can cut the panels out, ready to start sewing. We'll start on the end panels. Now this comes down to personal preference. You could either just go a straight up circle, which I think you see many duffel bags with that style. I wanted to go for kind of like a dome shape, just so it helped the bag kind of be a bit more vertical. In my mind that seems easier to access, but who knows. If you're going a circle, I would probably recommend about 25 centimeters in diameter. So if you are happy to do that, or if you have your own measurement, I would recommend drawing that out on a bit of paper so you can use that as a template. One benefit of doing a circle is that it is super easier to figure out the circumference, which if we can find the circumference, that means we can figure out the length of the main panel, because that is going to wrap around the circle. If you go down that pathway, those are your key measurements that you need to find. If you go down my pathway of doing an annoying dome, let's do that. I grabbed a bit of paper and started mapping out my key measurements. I did this on the fold just because I found that was easier to cut out a bit of paper. My width to be 12 centimeters on the fold, so the full width will be 24 centimeters. And then for the height of my full dome section, I think I went about 28 centimeters. So I just marked out a rectangle of this, and then I kind of free drew the curves. So for the top half, I want that to be a full semicircle. So I did my best to draw a semicircle, and then the bottom corner, I just wanted to round out slightly because that will make it easier when I go to attach the main panel onto these side panels. Because all of our circular edges are a little bit different, I then find it best to figure out the length of our main panel in the next step. So let's just focus on this for now. I drew out the shape of my dome, cut it out, and I wrote a little note that this one section in the middle is going to be on the fold, just so every time if I do go to cut it out again, I remember that. I then folded my material, matched the on the fold edge to this, and began cutting out my dome section. As I was cutting around this, I did make sure to include a 1 centimeter of seam allowance. So if you want to pre-mark this out, I would just measure 1 centimeter or like ½ an inch from all of the edges bar the on the fold edge. And that just means that we'll have some extra allowance ready for when we start sewing. I then cut out 2 panels to these dimensions, and that is going to be our 2 end panels. And then I thought it could be a cute addition to add a side pocket. So for this, I just cut out 2 more panels, which were only the bottom half of these side panels, as they're just going to be little side pockets that kind of just sit on the outer edges. You'll see when it comes to life. And I'm not adding seam allowance to the top edge, as I'm going to be covering this edge with the bias tape. If for some reason you don't like bias tape, you can then add 2 centimeters of seam allowance, and that's where we will add a folded hem later on. Then I cut out 2 replica pieces of the full side panels in the lining fabric. Once I've got those 2 side panels all cut out, this is when we can grab our measuring tape and measure around the edge of this shape. So once I find that measurement, I'm actually not going to add any seam allowance, just because we are going to be adding a zipper in there. The distance of that zipper ends up being the seam allowance that we would probably need. If that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, don't add seam allowance essentially. Now we can start figuring out the main panel measurements. So that measurement that we found around the side panel, that is going to be the longest measurement of the main panel. And then for the zipper length, we're going to add 3 centimeters of seam allowance to that. So once we're happy with those measurements, we can then cut out 1 main panel in the outer material and 1 main panel in the lining material. And then if you want to opt for the inner pocket, once again, this comes down to personal preference. I made the main back panel of this pocket the width of the zipper plus 3 centimeters of seam allowance. So I cut out 1 square at those dimensions. Then for the front of the pocket, I would recommend just cutting out a second piece, which is exactly a replica of the back piece. And then we're just going to cut across where we would like the zip to be. So for me, I wanted that about 1/3 down from the top. I found that I didn't end up needing to add seam allowance just because the extra height that it adds by adding it in there, that ends up being the seam allowance that you end up needing to attach it. So what you'll end up with is 2 outer end pieces, 2 lining end pieces, 2 outer pocket pieces, 1 main outer panel, 1 lining main panel, and 1 inner pocket, if that's what you chose to do. Now let's jump into the sewing. Like I mentioned, I am using a toweling material, which if you've ever used toweling before, it frays so bad and it just leaves little toweling worms everywhere. So before moving forward, I just went around and zigzag stitched all of the edges, and that will just help prevent it from fraying and being annoying. If you also have a material that you're finding is fraying quite a bit, this might be a good time to overlock all the edges or zigzag stitch, or just do whatever you feel to feel comfortable jumping into the sewing segment. First up, we're going to focus on prepping all the pocket areas. For the outer pockets, we'll start on the bias tape. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use the bias tape to clean up the top edge of this side pocket. So I trimmed the tape down to match the width of the pocket and then cut out a second piece and then laid it good sides facing. As you can tell here, there's not really a good or bad side, so I just went for it and chose one and aligned the raw edge of the panel to the top edge of the tape and sewed about 1 centimeter, or I guess approximately 1/2 inch off that edge. For this part as well, you could definitely just use a regular bias binding. Ended up just having some extra strap material, which I'm using for the handles later, and I just thought visually it would keep it nice and cohesive. And then I flipped that tape over so it is now sitting on the underside of the pocket, and made sure when I sewed this line it actually wasn't on top of the tape on the other side. So when I flip it over, you'll see that my sewing line sits on the toweling material and not on the tape area. I personally like that look better. Of course, if you want it to sit on top of the tape, just make sure that your thread matches whatever area you would prefer to sew on. So my thread matched the toweling material. And then I just repeated that for the top of the other pocket. Now with both top edges of the pocket section all nice and clean, I can attach it onto the side panels. So the actual side panel should be good sides facing up, and the pocket panel should also be facing good sides up. I laid it in place so the edges are all matching, and if you prefer you can pin it in place so it doesn't move around while you sew. Otherwise just jump into sewing around all these edges so it is all attached and I guess technically one piece now. And then you can see how it kind of functions as a pocket. Then for the inner pocket, we'll focus on attaching the zip in between the 2 front panels. To do this, we'll need to lay the good side of the fabric onto the good side of the zip. You'll be aligning the raw edge of the material to the outer edge of the zip. Then we'll just sew a line across here, pretty much where the zipper teeth begin and finish. You might need to move the zipper handle out of the way as you do this. As well, if you have a zipper foot, you can switch it over to that. Then I just repeated this process for the other side. So again, laying down the zipper with the good sides facing up, laying the second piece of fabric down so the good sides are facing, the raw edges are aligned, and then I'll just sew across that section again. That means the front panel is all done. That means we can just essentially look at that as one piece. We will lay the back piece and the front piece good sides facing. If you do find that there are any differences in size, say your zipper made the height smaller or longer, that's perfectly fine. Just trim it down to match or just sew in place, which makes sense. Pin down any key places and then jump over to the sewing machine. And for this, I just personally sewed down one side edge, the bottom edge and the other side edge, and I left the top edge just open as that will end up getting hidden in seams later. As I was sewing down the sides, you can see I have quite a bit of seam allowance just because I wanted to make sure that I was pretty much meeting the edges of the zipper teeth. Before flipping it good sides facing out, I just went around and trimmed any of the excess seam allowance away. Also, if you're worried it's going to fray too much, this might be a good time to zigzag stitch or overlock these edges as well. So now when I flip it with all the good sides facing out, it is a nice clean looking pocket with the zipper 1/3 of the way down, which is exactly what we wanted. Then to help future Maddie, I'm just going to attach this to the lining so it is there and ready to go later on. So the lining material should be good side facing up. The pocket is good side facing up when we lay it down, and I've just matched it to one of the shorter edges, which is where the zip is going to go, if that helps you identify the edge. Center it to that edge and then just sew a line across there. I'd probably try sew as close as I can to the edge so that line can then get hidden within the seam later on. Now it's time to attach the D-rings onto the side panels. So I ended up cutting 2 pieces out of my strap, which are 10 centimeters or 4 inches long. I found this personally to be a length that would allow me to go over the D-ring as well as fold up the front edge so it then hides the raw edge. Let me show you what I mean. I switched my machine over to a thread that matched the strap color and then just quickly zigzag stitch along this edge so it doesn't fray, just for a precaution, you know, gotta be safe sometimes. Then it was time to secure this strap onto the side panel. Offset the raw edge about 2 centimeters or 1 inch from that top. You'll see that the fold is going to be from about 1 centimeter or 1/2 inch below that raw edge. So if you want to practice folding it up to that line and then up from there again, you'll see where the D-ring is approximately going to sit. So you might want to test that out, make sure you're happy with it. Keeping in mind that about 1 centimeter of the side panel is going to disappear as seam allowance later on, which I personally liked that the D-ring was going to hang a little bit higher than this edge. So I pinned that in place, jumped over to the sewing machine and then sewed a line 1 centimeter down from the raw edge on that strap. Then I slipped the strap through the D-ring and folded up along that sewing line. Then to properly secure this in place, I'm going to do a rectangle sewing area. I find this will give it some strength, but it will also hide the raw edge of the folded piece that we put under there. You can pre-mark this out. I just kind of went for it. You can see that I'm about 1 centimeter off that bottom edge, so I sewed along there, turned the corner. If you don't know how to turn a corner, just swivel your needle so it is in the fabric, lift the foot up, turn the corner, and then put the foot back down, and you can just continue sewing along that edge. So I sewed down pretty much as close as I could to the bottom of that strap, turned the corner again, went entirely across the bottom, up the side and back to where I began. And now I'm happy with how that's looking. I then repeat that for the other side and I have 2 D-rings all strapped in place. To attach the fixed straps to the main bag panel, I grabbed the bit of fabric, which will be the outer main panel of the bag, and laid it good sides facing up, and then grabbed my strap, and again this will be laying down with the good sides facing up, so everything we see is what will be the final result. I laid it in place starting at the end of the strap, roughly in the center, just because this will be the bottom of the bag, so any overlapping sections will get hidden down there, and then mapped out where I wanted it to roughly sit, keeping in mind that for me the shorter edges is where the zip is going to go, and that is where I want the extra overhang for the handles to be. For me, I enjoyed it being about 15 centimeters off the edge, which is roughly 6 inches. So I pinned all across here to secure it in place. And the final pin is going to indicate where I turn and do my final sewing line. This was 10 centimeters off the zip edge, which is where the handles will overhang. So once the first section of pins was in place, I then figured out how long I wanted my handle section to be. Now this could come down to how much strap length you have. Otherwise, if you've been following my measurements, I then made the overhang where the strap meets the edge of the main panel to where that strap again will meet the other edge of the main panel. That for me was 40 centimeters. I then popped a line in these places so it could help me indicate where it should be in place as I'm sewing so it doesn't move. I kept it all flat, folded it around, met this line with the edge, and began the process of pinning and measuring on the other side as well. I made sure the first pin was about 10 centimeters off that edge where the strap overhang is, and then set off about 15 centimeters from the side edge. I continued this down to the other end, again offsetting the last pin by 10 centimeters, allowing 40 centimeters from the edge of overhang for the strap, and then meeting up over the other side to do the final area. Now everything is pinned in place where it will finally end up. I was content to trim the edge, and I made sure to leave an overhang of about 2 centimeters, and that means I can sew a final seam which will join these edges with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. I switched my thread to a color that matched my strap, and I just switched the machine to a zigzag stitch and zigzagged along the edges to prevent it from fraying. Then it was time to flip the straps around so they're good sides facing, and sew with that 1 centimeter seam allowance. And that means when I flip it around, so now the good sides are facing up, the seam will then get hidden underneath, and I can sew this all in place as one big long strap now. Okie dokie, now it is time to jump on the machine, switch it back to a straight stitch. I tried to stay as close as I could to the edge of the strap, started at the center, sewed down the entire length, turned the corner at that line which we marked at 10 centimeters off the edge, went across the width of the strap until I reached as close as I can to the edge, turned that corner, sewed down the entire length as close as I can to the edge, turned the corner again, went across the width, and then turned the corner back down the length to where I started. Once both of those straps were secured in place, I just did one extra sewing line just to help give it that extra secure dosage in case I load this bag up with lots of weight. And what I did is I went to the sewing line on either end of the strap where I went across the width and added a rectangle with the X in the middle. I started this rectangle by going down the edge, across the width, back up the edge, and then began the X process of joining the corners. At this point you might end up going over the same edges to create this X, but you know, the more lines we have, the stronger it will be. Now it's time to sew the zipper between the lining and the main panel. I laid down my lining with the good sides facing up. I then laid the zipper down so the edge of that matches the raw edge of the material, and this will be facing good sides facing up. So then I can create the final sandwiching process with the main panel good sides facing down. Essentially you want the lining facing good side up, the zipper facing good side up, and then the main panel good side facing down, so they're all facing each other, if that makes sense. Once I've got that all lined up, I just jumped on the sewing machine and sewed across this area, starting at the edge of where the zipper teeth start and then finish. And then I'll just repeat that process for the other side. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I have a jacket zipper, so this benefits me here where I can actually completely unzip it and then just do it separately on the other side. I just chose this out purely because I like the thicker look of it, and that was only available in the jacket style. There's nothing wrong with having a regular zip. I would actually probably recommend getting a regular zip if you can, just because it won't come undone as you zip the bag up and down. If you're like me, you can unzip it and do it separately in the same sandwiching method that we did before. Otherwise, if you have a regular zip where you can't undo it, it just means that you will now have the zipper attached to the other edges, and you'll just have to do a bit of a rearranging process where again you lay the lining good sides facing up, the zipper good sides facing up on top of that, except it will just be joined on the other side. But the sandwiching process is the same. It will just look a little bit more bunched up and need maybe a little bit more adjusting to get it working. So once you've completed the second side, you'll start to see the bag kind of coming together where there's a zip in the middle. You can pick it up by the handles, and now we just need to add the edges on to complete the bag section. To prep these edges, we're just going to attach the lining directly onto it, lay the outer panel with the good sides facing down and the bad side facing up, and lay the lining on top of this. If you prefer to see a certain side of the lining when you're looking into your bag, make sure that is facing upwards so you can see that, as this will be the edge that ends up showing on the inside. And then just pin around here and sew these two pieces together so they're all joined, and it will just make the next section much easier. So once that's ready to go, we will now start adding this side panel onto the main part of the bag. I would suggest starting at the top of the main panel where the zip is, and then the top of the side panel, lining this up and just working your way around, matching these edges, making sure that it is all good sides facing as you go around. For me personally, I must have over measured my side panel or added too much seam allowance, so you can see that I have a bit of extra material. I actually just created a bit of a dart in here because I thought if anything it just means that I'm going to have more space in here to add more stuff, whereas if this was something that I didn't want, I would then just create a seam and just trim out any of the extra seam allowance to make it all perfectly fit. In an ideal world, obviously we would like it to match up. Maybe that is something you can double check in steps earlier of aligning the main panel and the side panels and making sure that they all meet up once you've cut them out, and then you can trim off any excess material. But just keeping in mind, I just jumped on the sewing machine and sewed around this edge. Starting from the zipper area, I made sure to sew pretty much as close as I can to the edge of those teeth. This might mean adjusting the placement of the main panel and where it sits on the side panel. So for me, I had a little bit of overhang of my main panel, and then it evened out as I went around, and then I just repeated this on the second side panel. And that meant my bag was looking pretty cute. But as you can see, the inner seams are all quite messy, so I'm going to go fix that up now with some bias binding. This is optional. You can either just zigzag stitch or overlock these edges if you don't want this extra step. I just found I had some extra bias binding laying around, so I might as well create a nice clean inner seam area. To add the bias binding onto this seam area, if you haven't done this before, unfold the folded edge of the bias and lay this down so it is good sides facing onto the seam that you're attaching it to. Align the raw edge of the bias binding and the raw edge of the seam. Then you'll pin this in place and you'll end up sewing along the crease line of that bias binding that you unfolded. And then once you've done that first line of sewing, which helps attach it in place, we then go around and fold the rest of the bias binding around this raw seam area and do a final sewing line on the bottom edge. So what you have is a nice clean edge, no raw hems hanging out, and it makes it look nice. As you can see, my bias bindings are different colors. Just as I mentioned, these were just scraps from other projects, and they're not really going to get seen, so I don't really care if they're matching. And now we are finally up to the very final step, and that is just finishing off the final detachable strap. So the strap will end up permanently attached to the snap hooks. To do this, I switch my machine once again to a zigzag stitch and zigzag stitch the raw edge so it won't fray eventually, and then switch my machine back to a regular stitch and created one fold which is about 1 centimeter and sewed this in place. I then popped the edge of the strap through the snap hook and folded it over by about 3 centimeters or 1 inch and repeated the rectangle method where I then sewed this in place, getting as close as I can to the snap hook, down the side edge, across the width, and then back up the side edge again. For extra strength, of course, I can always add the X in the middle as well. And then to figure out where you would like the second edge to attach to the other hook, I would recommend throwing it on over your shoulders and figuring out how long you would like it to be. For me, I wanted the bag to sit kind of roughly around my waist area when it was hanging down, so just marked out where that was. Made sure that when I repeated the process of folding the edges onto the strap that it was going to be on the same side as the other edge. Personally, I didn't want my straps to be all twisted and facing different ways, so just double checked that and then just repeated the process of folding it over the snap hook and sewing it in place. And with that all done, my friends, that means we have a new duffel bag that we can take on travels or throw around to the gym and training and whatever you want to fill it with. Actually, wherever you end up using it, tag me at the Essentials Club, as I would love to see where your creations from my tutorials have ended up. If you did follow along, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it all made sense. It truly makes my day seeing what you have made. And on that note, I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are, and I'll see you guys in the upcoming videos. Bye!